You know, guys, I'm getting ready to go on a little bit of a scout this morning, and I wanted to take my camera with me to kind of show you guys around the Pathfinder property and do a video that talks about the resources and things that I looked for before we picked out this property, and the things that you could look for in a wilderness type property, or, you know, a property that you would use to raise your family on that could possibly be off the grid if necessary and would provide you the resources that you need to raise your family if nothing else was available. And before I went out this morning, I kind of want to talk to you guys. I got a letter this weekend when I went to Indianapolis for a business meeting. My mother often gets gifts and letters and things like that sent to the Pathfinder School in care of my name from my viewers and supporters, and I really appreciate all of those things, guys. And I don't talk about that stuff very much because it's kind of embarrassing to me. But one thing that I did want to touch on with you guys is a particular letter that was sent to me by Steve Stanley from Howell, Michigan, and it's addressed to the Pathfinder School. And really all it was an article from an unknown magazine or a book, because there's no, I assume it's a magazine or a book, there's no identifying marks anywhere other than page numbers that say where this came from. But it's very interesting to me, and I want to kind of discuss it with you guys today and read you some excerpts from it. It's written by Stephen M. Watts, and I assume that's the Stephen Watts that's a professor, a historical professor at the University of Missouri, and it's called Classic Camping, the Frontier Connection. And it brings me to an interesting discussion, and maybe I could answer some questions along with this. That, you know, a lot of people say in this business that you have to have mentors or you just don't know anything. Well, that's not true. Mentors to me most of my mentors are long since dead. Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Horace Kephart, George Washington Sears, people like that that were frontier legends that I've read their stories, their biographies, their books, their journals. Lewis and Clark, those are my mentors. If I had any live or living mentors, it would have been people like John Curry, Mark Baker, Jim Jacobs, guys that practiced 18th century living, you know, for a living, basically, and they did it all the time. And those people are people that I learned a lot of things from, as well as my own experimental archaeology and just going out and trial and erroring things. And that's how I created the Pathfinder system, was through trial and error, through frontier living mentality, to understand what it actually took to survive in a wilderness situation. So as far as, you know, I've never watched, Ron Hood was a very, very good friend of mine, and I've never watched a single one of his DVDs. I have friends in this business that I've talked to that I've never read their books. I've never watched any of their DVDs. And it's not because I don't think it's worthwhile information. It's because I want my mind open to everything. And when you get into that mentor mentality, you tend to get tunnel vision and only learn what the mentor teaches you, and you don't experiment for yourself sometimes. And I think that's the most important thing about learning wilderness skills, is to experiment for yourself and find out what works for you. Because what works for me may not necessarily work for you. But I look at this article or this book or whatever this came out of, and I've never read this before, and I was sitting on my mother's couch reading this over the weekend when I got it in the mail from this gentleman or young man, it may be the case, I'm not sure, and everything in it rang so true with me in the Pathfinder system that I was like, whoever wrote this article, you know, Stephen Watts, must have been reading my mind when he wrote it. And a couple excerpts out of here that I wanted to read to you real quick. I don't want to bore you with the entire article because it would probably take me a half an hour. I'm kind of a slow study when it comes to things like that. But I wanted to read to you just a quick excerpt from this. And this part of it was written by, there are a lot of excerpts in here from different people, including but not limited to Daniel Carter Beard, who was the founder of the Boy Scouts of America. And it says, it's no accident that Daniel Baird named the pre-Boy Scout youth programs the Sons of Daniel Boone and the Boy Pioneers. Organizing them into forts and stockades, old Uncle Dan came to it honestly. Born in 1850 in Ohio, happenstance, the old Northwest frontier, he spent his formative years in Kentucky, the storied land of Daniel Boone himself. He was only one generation removed from his backwoods heroes. His father knew the famous frontiersman and Boone's companion Simon Kenton, another famous Ohio frontiersman. He also knew Jim Bowie, Sam Houston, and for certain Mr. David Crockett. Beard urged his boys to perfect their camping and woodcraft skills and to become like these men, American knights in buckskin. Although today we may sometimes flinch as Beard's enthusiasm slips over into muscular jiganism, we can only admire his energetic and good-natured drive to recapture the frontier spirit and inspire young charges. And this is very, very important for us to understand, as part of why we developed the Pathfinder Youth Group, is because kids are our future, and we need to teach them, we need to train them, we need to educate them in wilderness living skills and, being more self-reliant. And I think that's slipping away today in the Boy Scouts of America, and it's a real shame. I wanted to read an excerpt here that was written by Daniel Carter Beard from 1939. It says, "For my inspiration, I did not summon to my aid King Arthur and his round table, the glistening armor of the tourney, Richard the Lion-Hearted, or the Saracens, not even Robin Hood, though he was more my type of man. In place of the lance and buckler was the American long rifle and buckskin clothing. In place of the shining plumed helmet was the American coonskin cap. The tail of the coon, its plume. I tried to put into organization the joyousness of the blue sky with its fleeting clouds, the reliability and stability of the earth beneath our feet, and the natural democracy of Daniel Boone himself." Daniel Carter Beard, 1939. And I think that's a very important statement by him, saying that, what he tried to inspire or instill in the American Boy Scouts was the frontier mentality. The frontier mentality. Here's another excerpt I want to read you real quick. "With their meager equipment and perhaps some jerked meat and parched corn in their pouches and a tightly rolled blanket, the buckskin men traversed the American wilderness from end to end. From generations of wilderness men and women came the outdoor lore and wildwood wisdom of today, and thoroughly great American folklore that is becoming increasingly important in the lives of all modern Americans." If you think about that, that rings true in 2011, 2012. This was written by Ellsworth Yeager in 1945. So it's not nothing new in this day and age that our frontier and our wildwood wisdom, as he called it, is slipping away. There's also a lot of excerpts in here from Horace Kephart, who wrote Camping and Woodcraft. I'll give you an excerpt from him real quick. "From the autumn of 1904 to the winter of 1906, I lived most of the time alone in a little cabin on the Carolina side of the Great Smoky Mountains, surrounded by one of the finest primeval forests in the world. My few neighbors were born backwoodsmen. Most of them dwelt in log cabins of 1 or 2 rooms, roofed with clapboards, riven with a froe, and heated by hardwood logs in wide stone fireplaces. Many had no cooking stoves, but baked on the hearth and fried their meat over embers. Nearly every man in the settlement was a skilled axeman and a crack shot. Some of them still used homemade muzzle-loading rifles with barrels over 4 feet long. Some of the women still worked at a handmade spinning wheel and loom. Coonskins and ginseng passed as currency at the wayside stores. Our manner of life was not especially changed from that of the old colonial frontier. To one coming from the cities, it was a strange environment, almost as though he had been carried back, asleep upon the wings of time, and had awakened in the 18th century to meet Daniel Boone in the flesh and blood." Horace Kephart, 1916. "Because we are so close to pioneer days, outside life seemed to mean destruction of the wildlife. We killed the game recklessly, we caught the fish from the streams, pulled up the wildflowers by the roots, and we even destroyed the songbirds to get feathers for ladies' hats." Dan Beard, 1939, and he's talking about, taking care of the land and fathering the land and passing it on for the next generation. And that's important. Wilderness conservation of resources, as we talk about in the Pathfinder system, was important then in 1939 as it is today in 2011. And all of these things ring so true with the way I teach and the things that I do. It's amazing, reading some of this stuff in this article. There's quite a few quotes in here. He goes on to talk about fire starting and fire making in the frontier, and he talks about the fact that, from medieval times, fire making from medieval times through the 19th century was mainly by flint and steel. That was certainly true on the American frontier. Other methods, including burning lenses, gun locks, and possibly friction fire techniques, abound, but mainly was used by friction fire. And what he's talking about there is he's saying that, through the 18th century, before the advent of instant flame and instant gratification like matches, flint and steel was the technique for starting fire. So you made a fire, you made more char cloth, or you punked more wood, or you charred more punk wood, or whatever you used for your tinder, and at that point, your next fire would come from flint and steel, whether it was from your gun lock or from a piece of flint and a file that was forged into a fire steel. So it's important to understand that, because there's so much romance in the survival world today with friction fire with sticks, hand drill fires, bow drill fires. Those were not often used in the frontier because of one thing: reliability. And that's what I teach in the Pathfinder system. You want bulletproof techniques. Now that with the advent of the ferro rod, you can see that we're almost going back to the days of flint and steel. We've lost that. Matches are the greatest thing since sliced bread. Instant flame is not all it's cracked up to be, because lighters get wet, fluid runs out, fluid evaporates, things like that happen. But that ferrocerium rod that's made from the same type of materials and more that flint and steel actually made by striking pieces of iron off of that fire striker, which is a pyrophoric and spontaneously combusts when it combined with oxygen. All the things that are on that ferro rod are exactly the same, including magnesium. And so with the advent of the ferro rod, we now are going back to our flint and steel roots, and it becomes a more standard fire starting device, along with some type of accelerant to make sure fire, than matches or instant flame. This induced me to resolve and not travel more by land without my gun, powder and shot, steel sponge, punk wood, and flint for striking steel. Patrick Campbell, 1792. There's quite a few excerpts in here from the 1700s and the early 1800s. Here we borrowed a smoking bag containing a steel, flint, and tinder. John McLean, 1822. Fungus that grows on the outside of the birch tree takes fire readily from the spark and steel, but it must be improved by being kept dry in a bag that has contained gunpowder. That was his method of drying out tinder fungus and absorbing the moisture from it into the gunpowder. Samuel Huron, 1772. So you can see that these men relied on their wits, on their skill, and on bulletproof techniques that were tried and proven from medieval times through the frontier days of flint and steel to make their fires. And we still today rely on flint and steel in the form of a ferrocerium rod and the back of our knife or a hacksaw blade to make that fire. But I thought this was a very, very interesting article. I read the whole thing. There's other things in here that I could read to you, but I don't want to bore you too much with all of this stuff. It goes into, the makeup of different fire kits. There's quotes in here from Mark Baker. There's quotes in here from some very famous writers, about frontier living, like Ellsworth Yeager, like Horace Kephart, like George Washington Sears, like Dan Beard. And it's just a very, very impressive article that really embodies what I believe in the Pathfinder system and what I teach. And I thank you very much, Steve Stanley, for sending me this article. It has given me new enlightenment as well as new encouragement in the things that I do. There was a letter with this, a short letter that came with this that just says, "To Dave C." And this is why I assume this might have been a younger person that wrote this. It says, "To Dave C. I was not sure how to get this to you. Thanks, Steve S." So that may have been a younger person that wrote this, but it may have been an older gentleman as well. But either way, Steve, I thank you very much for this. It's rekindled some new fires in my haversack, and I appreciate that. So with that said, I'm going to gather up my stuff for a scout, and we're going to go out and do a tour of the Pathfinder property, and that will be the next video after this one in the Journal of the Yurt. I thank you very much, guys, for listening to me ramble for 20 minutes there.